Thou Art Awesome. This game, not so much. It's Roland's Curse on Game Boy Works. As a lifelong fan of Zelda-style action RPGs, I'm always on the hunt for the ones that slipped past my notice back in the day. Roland's Curse, alas, reminds us that sometimes they slip past because they just aren't that good. The Game Boy saw a handful of notable top-down action RPGs in its lifetime. Of course, there was The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening, arguably the finest game on the system. And we can't forget about the ambitious yet sloppy Final Fantasy Adventure, the freewheeling Final Fantasy spin-off that gave us the Mana series. The system's other games of this type, however, tend to go unremarked upon. And as we see here, maybe there's a reason for that. Roland's Curse comes to us courtesy of American Sammy, who published and perhaps localized the game for the US market. If Sammy was indeed the company responsible for the English language text here, I kind of love them, but we'll get to that. Development duties on Roland's Curse, however, were handled by a company called NMK, Nippon Microcomputer Kaihatsu. NMK came about following the dissolution of Universal, best known for Mr. Do, and apparently the studio pulled together some former Tekkon Tecmo staff. NMK isn't one of the better-known developers in video game history, but they did a lot of contract work for Jaleco and Sammy on a fair few arcade and NES releases you'd probably recognize. These include City Connection, Ninja Crusaders, and WHOMP. So they're not exactly nobodies, even if they aren't exactly household names. Roland's Curse falls right in the middle of NMK's lifetime, and honestly it's unlike any previous project they had developed. Vaguely actionish, ostensibly an RPG, Roland's Curse feels like a clumsy and oddly linear rendition of Zelda. While it bears some resemblance to familiar and beloved action RPGs, Roland's Curse is kind of its own thing. If Nintendo had ever tried to adapt the Zelda series into an arcade format, it might not have landed too far to the side of Roland's Curse. And that's actually not a poor endorsement as such things go, but NMK didn't quite deliver on this elevator pitch. There's really not much to Roland's Curse. You can easily breeze through this game your first time through in a couple of hours. I did. No cheat codes or facts required. It's basically a series of interconnected dungeons divided into 3 chapters, if you can call them that, and a final boss battle. Each chapter unfolds roughly the same way. You begin in a town, enter a cavern, find the exit to the next cavern, eventually passing through another town or two before taking on a boss and moving along to the next chapter. The middle town in each phase contains 2 exits, one of which leads ahead and one of which takes you to a dead-end castle. The castles are okay for farming upgrades and gear, although there's really not much call for that in this particular game. Like I said, Roland's Curse is incredibly limited, so there aren't many opportunities and improvements for you to hunt down. You can alternate between 2 different weapon types and about half a dozen secondary weapons, health boosts, and strength upgrades. That's it. On top of that, your maximum health and physical strength reset after every chapter, so even the upgrades you acquire feel fleeting at best. I can't stress what an odd little game this is. One that seemingly defies the conventions of its own genre. Though whether that's a result of confidence or just clumsiness, I can't really say. Like I said, Roland's Curse is hardly a difficult game. The only real challenge here results from just how stiff and awkwardly it plays. Despite being an action RPG from 1990, Roland's Curse moves more like a Famicom or PC game from about 1984 or 85. Your protagonist, whose name is never given in-game, moves a bit like the mech suit in Afterburst, by which I mean that rather than gliding through the world a pixel at a time, he moves in half-tile increments. This makes for a decidedly clunky interface, especially since the protagonist can't move and attack at the same time. This leads to you suffering a lot of cheap damage from enemies, who tend to move quickly, soak up a lot of damage, and often respawn beneath your feet and force you to take unfair damage. This would all be infuriating if not for the fact that the game is extremely generous with its penalties when you die. If you run out of health, you simply go back to the entrance of the current cavern, retaining your current power upgrades, equipment, and maximum health. This makes the game way too easy, but that's better than being infuriatingly unfair. To make things even easier, this game has to contain the easiest to acquire health upgrades I've ever encountered. While you'll find some health boosts in chests scattered throughout the world, there are certain enemies who drop them as random loot pretty often. Almost every level contains at least one spot where you can farm armor boosts from respawning enemies and top out your max health in like 5 minutes tops. In fact, each enemy type drops specific loot, so once you realize these connections, it becomes trivial to customize your little adventurer to be the hero you need and deserve. Your little guy here can wield 2 different weapons, a sword and a rod that flings fireballs. Like everything about Roland's Curse, this feature is wildly unbalanced. There's no real use to the sword once you acquire a fire rod. The rod throws ranged projectiles that can pass through barriers, and you can rapid fire them. And they have no mana cost or anything. And the fireballs are every bit as powerful as the blade. Meanwhile, the sword has a one-tile range and can only be swung at a sluggish rate. The game's bosses are almost impossible to beat with a sword, and a breeze with a rod. In fact, you can easily use the rod to defeat the next to last boss without taking a single hit. In addition to your main weapon, you can also collect half a dozen different items to use with the A button. These don't work the way items do in Zelda, in that there's no inventory screen or management. Once you collect an accessory, that's the only one you have access to. To switch, you have to find a different accessory, which will permanently replace whichever one you're currently carrying. The accessories range in value from extremely useful to completely worthless. The worst offenders are the chameleon ring and the shield, both of which offer passive defensive capabilities. Roland's Curse is not a game that has enough subtlety to reward passivity, though. The shield, for example, can only block projectiles. It doesn't protect against collisions with bad guys. But only a handful of enemies fire projectiles, and they do so somewhat erratically and unpredictably. Their attacks travel pretty quickly, too, while you have to stop moving and actively activate the shield in order to defend yourself with it, which makes it more or less useless. Similarly, the chameleon ring allows you to transform into a piece of scenery, which prevents you from taking damage. But there are almost no situations where it's better to stop moving and bunker down to brace for an attack than it is to kill off a foe or simply avoid it. The most useful tools here are the magic axe and the health potion, the latter of which refills all your hearts. It's the only limited use item in the game. Once you restore your energy, the potion vanishes. On the other hand, the magic axe, which is specifically a pickaxe, offers unlimited uses. This tool allows you to break through certain barriers in order to activate shortcuts or reach otherwise inaccessible treasures, which is great. But really though, the only items worth hunting down throughout the entire game are health and strength boosts. Pretty much all the other items are mostly worthless, and you'll only want to swap between them at specific times. So it's an odd little game. Despite its brevity, there's a lot of repeated content. Many sections in each chapter are recycled from other chapters, with enemy and treasure placement changed. The game gets harder as you advance due to enemies growing in speed and strength with each new chapter. Stationary skulls suddenly begin zipping across the screen, floating eye monsters begin drifting in wider patterns, bats circle wildly. Even the humble slimes from the very outset of the adventure eventually stop scooting forward and begin to sort of vibrate in place, making it difficult to hit them and impossible to simply skip past them. Meanwhile, your poor protagonist has a maximum health cap, and I think one for attack too. So there's no real way to balance yourself to compensate for the increased ferocity of the later enemies. Roland's Curse has no economy, so there's no way to buy better stuff. The towns are practically devoid of interactivity. You can talk to citizens, and most towns have a treasure chest with something in it, but really these spaces exist as breathers between combat zones. You can't enter any homes or peer into wells. These are just spaces where the same 4 NPC sprites spout gibberish. But at least it's glorious gibberish. I have no idea who localized Roland's Curse because the game includes no credits, but the English language text here is some wild stuff. It's about 50% Dragon Warrior-inspired late Middle English, written by someone who really doesn't understand the proper grammar for these and thous and whences. The other 50% is wacky 90s slang, like telling you to go rock that turkey before you fight the final boss, or a random NPC proclaiming that thou art awesome. I love super weird old localizations like this, as publishers began to hire people who actually spoke English, but there were no real standards or objectives for localization in place. But that's about all I love when it comes to Roland's Curse. Even the soundtrack is a miss. It's well crafted in terms of sonic quality, but the music consists almost entirely of 3-second loops that go from repetitive to grating to murder-inspiring in a matter of minutes. Between its clumsy mechanics, linear design, and general lack of anything exciting, the real Roland's Curse was the game itself. Supposedly the sequel is greatly improved, but that's a long, long way away. So for now, this is what we're stuck with. And alas, that's the note we're going out on with this chapter of Game Boy Works. We've made it a year and a half from the system's launch, and we'll jump back in and explore the Game Boy's releases for the final 6 weeks of 1990, which is several dozen games, after taking a nice long break to explore some other platforms. So next time on Game Boy Works, I'll see you in, I don't know, 2020 or so.